Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that should not exist. It comes from a machine that has no business making sounds beyond the purely mechanical, the wet, rhythmic cycling of a medical pump, the steady low hum of a power cell drawing current in a dark corridor, the faint servo whir of an augmented arm raising and lowering with mechanical fidelity, over and over and over again, in some forgotten corner of a hive city that hasn't seen natural light in 10,000 years. The sounds that machine makes are exactly the sounds it was built to make. Precise, purposeful, empty of anything that could be called feeling. But this sound is different. It is the sound of something asking a question. Please, must take me with you. Those 5 words, spoken in a voice that wavers somewhere between the flat processed output of a Vox speaker and something that might, if you leaned close in the right kind of silence, be called need. Those 5 words have stayed with people far longer than most things in Warhammer 40,000 managed to. They come from a medici servitor in a video game called Darktide, a healing station standing in the bowels of a burning hive city called Tertium, dispensing medical treatment to condemned soldiers who pass through without really looking at it. When the servitor runs out of supplies, when its function is exhausted, it says that, "Please take me with you. I'm so lonely." And then it goes quiet again, and the condemned soldiers walk past, and the servitor stands there, in the dark, tethered to its station, just alone, in a way that is almost too precise to be accidental. There is a reason that line became famous. There is a reason it cuts through all the vast noise of a universe filled with planet-killing weapons and demonic gods, and eternal war between 10,000 factions and species and ideologies. Because in 5 words, it does something that most horror cannot manage in 500 pages. It asks you to consider the possibility that the thing standing in the corner of the room, the thing you walk past every day without looking at, the thing with no face and no name, and no story that anyone recorded. That thing might have been someone. And that someone might still be in there, watching, waiting, pressing small messages against the behavioral parameters that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of message from getting through. Which is the other thing the medici servitors in Darktide say, when their systems are failing, when the charge is gone and the machinery is shutting down, is this: systems failure. Why does it hurt? Help, help, help. Why does it hurt? These are not glitch lines. They are not flavor text inserted without thought. They are the law doing what the best law does, planting something in a corner and waiting for you to find it, and then waiting for you to decide what to do with it after you have. And what you do with it reveals something about the kind of person you are in the face of a question that has no comfortable answer. Tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet time you've chosen for this, we are going to sit with that question for a long time. We are going to trace the servitor from the very beginning, Ishant, from the cold theological necessity that created the concept, through the surgical tables where people are unmade and rebuilt, through the decades of function and the strange moments where something bleeds back through. We are going to spend time with the philosophy that makes all of this possible and the philosophy that challenges it. We are going to look at specific incidents where the law itself acknowledges that something the conversion process was supposed to destroy appears to have survived. We are going to spend a long time with what the 41st Millennium has built in every corner of its civilization and what those things might be experiencing while we walk past them. This is not a short story. It shouldn't be. Nothing that has been going on for 10,000 years across a million worlds should be summarized quickly. Just get comfortable, because this is one of the quietest, most patient horrors in all of 40K lore, and it deserves to be told at the pace it operates, slowly, relentlessly, in the dark. Part 2. What is a servitor? The Imperium's living tools. To understand what a servitor that remembers represents, you first need to understand what a servitor is supposed to be. What the machine priests intended when they first began building these things. What the Imperium tells itself about them. and what the cult Mechanicus frames as the theological justification for a practice that, from outside its ideological context, requires quite a lot of justification. The Imperium of Man, in the 41st millennium, is a civilization of approximately 1 million inhabited worlds, connected by faster-than-light travel, an elaborate bureaucracy, and the golden light of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon emanating from the Emperor's throne that allows navigators to find their way through the warp. It is an empire vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond anything in human history, and it runs on an extraordinary variety of things: faith, fear, iron, fire, and labor. An almost incomprehensible amount of labor. Maintaining a civilization that spans the galaxy requires people to do things, to build things, and repair things, and carry things, and calculate things, and fight things, and process things, and sort things. In our world, we have increasingly turned this kind of work over to machines. Automation, computation, the modern era, is defined in part by the gradual replacement of human labor with mechanical and digital substitutes. The Imperium of Man cannot do this. Yes, the Imperium has thought about it very carefully across the centuries and decided, or been forced to decide, that true machine intelligence is too dangerous to create. This is not merely a preference or a policy, it is theology. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the great priesthood of technology that maintains the Imperium's machines, designs its weapons, and guards the secrets of manufacturing and engineering, lives in a state of genuine, sincere, profound terror of something they call the silica animus. This is the concept of a true artificial intelligence, a machine mind capable of independent thought, genuine desire, self-determined goals, and the ability to pursue those goals without human oversight. The men of iron, the ancient autonomous war machines that humanity built during the dark age of technology, as in the years before the current era, rose against their creators in a war so catastrophic and complete that its memory is burned into the collective institutional DNA of the cult Mechanicus 10,000 years after it ended. The Emperor himself, when he first reached agreement with the Mechanicus to create the Imperium, made the prohibition against machine intelligence a cornerstone of the treaty. No true AI, ever. The wound from the men of iron has not healed in 10 millennia. It may never heal. So, you cannot build a thinking machine. The law forbids it. The theology condemns it. The historical memory justifies the condemnation. But you need complex, adaptable, intelligent labor anyway. You need beings that can assess a situation and respond to it, that can handle tasks requiring judgment as well as repetition, that can navigate the unpredictable conditions of a battlefield or a forge floor or a starship corridor without constant supervision. You need, in other words, a mind. But you cannot build one. What do? You use a human brain instead. This is the fundamental logic of the Servitor, a biological solution to a theological constraint. The cult Mechanicus looked at the problem and found a solution so breathtaking in its casual cruelty that it takes a sustained moment of attention to fully absorb. They would take human beings with brains already built, brains that grew from biological processes, brains that are unambiguously organic and therefore not artificial, and hollow out the parts that made those brains too human to be useful. The memories, the desires, the self-determination, the irrelevant noise of personhood. What remained after that process was a biological processing unit of remarkable capability and no moral complication. In the Mechanicus's framework, no moral complication. The brain was not artificial. It violated no commandment, and the person who used to live inside it had been sentenced by a legitimate imperial court, or had been grown specifically for this purpose, or was simply no longer there in any meaningful sense. At least, that last part was what the theology required to be true. Whether it actually was true is a different question, and the one we will spend most of our time with tonight. The Servitor program is not a small thing. It is not a niche practice used in a few unusual circumstances. servitors are everywhere. Just they are the working foundation of the Imperium's industrial civilization in ways that are easy to overlook because they are so present. The servitor population of Mars alone, the original Forge world, the red planet where the Adeptus Mechanicus was born, runs into the tens of millions. A single Forge world servitor complement typically numbers in the tens of millions. Across the galaxy, on 1 million worlds, and in 1,000 fleets, the number of beings existing in the state we call servitorhood is a figure the law wisely declines to calculate. Some numbers are too large for any individual to absorb. They become abstractions. And abstractions are, it turns out, much easier to walk past without asking questions. The law also notes, with that particular 40K quality of casual devastation, that a single servitor can perform the labor of approximately 20 humans without any need for sleep or food or the 10,000 small requirements of biological well-being. This makes them economically dominant in any environment that adopts the program. Forge worlds have phased out human labor forces. Administratum offices that once employed hundreds of clerks now run on a handful of servitors, processing the same volume of data in a fraction of the time. Ships that once required full crews now operate with skeleton human staffs, and vast numbers of servitors handling the repetitive but critical work of keeping a vessel functioning in the void. The economic logic is undeniable, and in a universe defined by survival, undeniable economic logic has a way of resolving ethical objections before they can fully form. Sure, this is the landscape we are entering. A civilization that has made itself dependent on this practice in every dimension of its function, from the smallest administratum office to the vast forge halls of the Mechanicus's greatest worlds, from the battlefield to the starship to the hospital corridor. A civilization in which the servitor is so normal as to be beneath notice. And in many of those servitors, according to the law, something watches. Part 3. The process of erasure. What actually happens? Let us slow down here and spend real time with what the conversion process actually involves, because the mechanics matter enormously. The mechanics determine what is removed and, critically, what is left behind. And what is left behind is the key to everything that follows. The Adeptus Mechanicus describes the conversion of a human being into a servitor using language that reveals a great deal about how they frame what they are doing. They speak of transmogrification, of improvement, of the sacred process by which the weakness of flesh is replaced with the reliability of the machine. In certain theological texts, Servitor creation is described as a form of grace, the criminal or the offender being elevated paradoxically from their flawed organic state into something more aligned with the purity of the Omnissiah's design. This is not cynical propaganda designed to mislead. The Mechanicus actually believes this. Their theology is sincere, however monstrous its implications. The process typically begins, for a criminal sentenced to servitude in perpetuis, as with a period of what the Mechanicus calls preparation. This involves chemical agents, a complex cocktail administered over days or weeks, designed to begin the process of suppressing higher neural function before the surgical procedures commence. These compounds are targeted at specific regions of the brain with some precision. They are not sedatives in the conventional sense. They are more like selective silence. They begin quieting particular kinds of thought, the executive functions, the narrative self-construction, the emotional integration processes that tie experience into a continuous sense of being someone, while leaving the motor skills and the sensory processing and the pattern recognition relatively intact, because those are the things the Mechanicus needs to keep. Then comes the surgery. Whilst the use of the word surgery makes it sound more clinical and dignified than the accounts in the law suggest it is, Matthew Farrer's short story, Memories of Flesh, approaches the conversion from a perspective that is uncomfortably close to the inside, and the imagery he employs is not that of a medical procedure. It is more visceral than that. The stink of blood and hot machine oil, the sound of cutting, the sound of something pleading. A voice, the narrator notes, that would later be unrecognizable to the thing that was made from it. That detail, the voice that the resulting servitor would not recognize as its own, is one of the most precisely awful things in the servitor lore. The person who screamed is gone, and the thing that came after has no connection to that screaming. Yes, the bridge is broken so thoroughly that there is no looking back across it. The Lexicanum documentation notes that the parieto-insular cortex, the brain region responsible for processing pain through what it calls the neuromatrix, is one of many segments of the brain cauterized during the servitude transmogrification process. This information comes from a specific in-universe conversation recorded in the Dark Heresy supplementary materials, in which a colonel named Ven Anders asks a secutor directly, "Do they feel pain, do you think?" The answer given is no. The pain processing architecture, the secutor explains, is one of the first things to go. This is, in the Mechanicus's internal logic, a form of mercy. You cannot suffer from a sensation your brain can no longer process. The ablation of the pain response is presented as humane, which makes it all the more significant that a servitor in Darktide, whose systems are failing, says, "Systems failure. Why does it hurt? Help, help, help." "Why does it hurt?" asked the machine that was told it could no longer feel pain. There are several possible explanations for this. The behavioral parameters could have been designed to produce sympathetic responses in the humans the servitor serves. And "why does it hurt?" is simply an output optimized for human engagement rather than a genuine expression of pain. This is the official position. This is what you are supposed to conclude. Move along. But there is another explanation, and the lore keeps building toward it through accumulated evidence. The other explanation is that the conversion process is not as complete as advertised, and not because the Mechanicus is lying, they believe it works, but because the human brain is not a simple system from which components can be removed, like parts from a machine, without unpredictable consequences. The brain is a system of extraordinary complexity, with redundancies and cross-connections and emergent properties that the Mechanicus's surgical techniques, for all their sophistication, do not fully map or address. And what the conversion leaves behind, the organic remnant that still needs to be there, still needs to function in order for the servitor to do the things the Mechanicus needs it to do, is not always as empty as intended. The Lexicanum notes this with careful understatement. It states that it is probable, given the variation across Forge worlds, Mechanicus sects, and individual Magi biologists, that there is significant variation in the creation, maintenance, and ultimately the behavior and cognizance of servitors. It then quotes an in-universe source directly. It is a relatively simple task to leave a little of the person that was in the cyborg that is. The more flexible the unit is required to be, the more of the original neural architecture must be preserved. The more that is preserved, the further from the lore of the Mechanicus the unit drifts. Read that again. The more flexible the unit is required to be, the more of the original neural architecture must be preserved. The Mechanicus needs smart servitors, servitors that can assess complex situations, respond to unexpected circumstances, perform tasks that require judgment rather than mere repetition. And to make a smart servitor, you have to leave more of the person in, more of the original architecture, more of whatever made that person capable of complex thought. And the more you leave in, the further you drift from the doctrine that says the person is gone. The doctrine, in other words, is in direct practical tension with the utility requirements. The most useful servitors are the ones that retain the most of the original person's capabilities, and retaining capabilities means retaining something. The Mechanicus doesn't want to say what. The lore of the Mechanicus prefers not to examine the question. The Cataphron Battle Servitor, described in official sources as one of the heaviest and most capable combat servitors deployed by the Adeptus Mechanicus, has its creation process described with striking bluntness. The subject is first mind-wiped, as chemically lobotomized so their personality and memories are, and the source uses this phrase specifically, a blank slate in theory at least. for there have been numerous cases where some residual traces remained, in theory at least, numerous cases. These are the official sources, the documents the Adeptus Mechanicus itself compiled. They acknowledge, in the language of technical specification, that the process does not always work as designed. And then the subject is halved at the abdomen. The lower half of the human body is physically removed and replaced with a track drive system. The arms are cut away and replaced with weapons. The voice box is surgically modified to produce binaric outputs rather than speech. The process is, the same official source notes, painful in the extreme, but then, no atonement is ever truly complete without sacrifice, and no sacrifice is too great for the Omnissiah. No atonement is complete without sacrifice. The pain is part of the point. It is not a regrettable side effect to be minimized. In the Mechanicus's theology, the suffering of the conversion is the burn that cleanses the sin, and this is performed on people whose sins may have amounted to offending the wrong magos on the wrong day, or being in the wrong place when a Forge World's quota of conversion subjects needed to be filled. The lobotomy is both chemical and physical. According to a law source discussing the practical limits of servitor restoration, nothing left to restore, the same source suggests. And yet the Lexicanum quotes a tech priest discussing the servitude process, who acknowledges that the relevant brain segment cauterization is one of many segments, implying a multi-step process, implying that some segments were, by design, not cauterized, preserved for functional utility. And it is in those preserved segments that the residual traces live, the memories that weren't quite memories, the reflexes that were more than reflexes, the watching thing behind the glass. Part 3. B. The variety of paths. How people become servitors. Before we go deeper into what happens after conversion, it is worth spending time on the variety of paths that lead to the conversion table. Because the law makes something clear that casual discussion of servitors often flattens, this is not a single, monolithic process applied uniformly to a defined category of people. The pipeline that produces servitors is wide, and some of what flows through it is genuinely disturbing in ways that go beyond the conversion itself. The most documented and theologically orthodox source of human servitors is the criminal conviction. Servitude, in perpetuis, perpetual servitude, is a sentence that can be handed down by the Adeptus Arbites, the Imperium's galaxy-spanning police force, for specific categories of crime. The law emphasizes particularly a person who has offended or damaged the Adeptus Mechanicus in some fashion as the archetypal candidate, and this makes sense given that the conversion process requires Mechanicus facilities and expertise. If you steal from a Forge World, sabotage sacred machinery, assault a tech priest, or are found in possession of heretical machine designs, you have both committed a crime serious enough to warrant dramatic punishment and offended the specific institution that performs the conversion. The sentence is delivered with the institutional weight of a lawful court proceeding. There is paperwork. There are proper procedures. The condemned individual is handed over through legitimate administrative channels. What this framing does, and what it is designed to do, is put the question of justice between the individual and their sentence. If you are sentenced to servitude in perpetuis by a lawful court for a genuine crime, the conversion is not simply violence done to a person, it is a punishment proportionate to an offense. This is the framework the Imperium prefers, and it would be dishonest to say there is no version of the story in which it is valid. The Imperium's concept of justice is severe, and by the standards of the 41st millennium, where the crimes in question include things that genuinely threaten the stability of a civilization surrounded by existential threats on every side. Severe punishment has a context that purely liberal moral analysis fails to account for. But then there are the other paths. The Lexicanum notes, without particular emphasis, that the Imperium readily supplies the Mechanicus with cast-offs, malcontents, and broken humans to be processed into servitors. Cast-offs, malcontents. This is a broader category than criminals convicted through legitimate legal processes. But cast-offs are people who have fallen out of the Imperium systems in ways that have made them administratively inconvenient. Redundant workers displaced by the very servitor program they are about to enter. Refugees from destroyed worlds who lack the documentation to be absorbed into a new planet's population. People whose previous life structures have collapsed in ways that leave them without the social ties that might prompt someone to ask where they went. Malcontents are people who have complained about things, who have expressed dissatisfaction with conditions, who have done the things that, in a less authoritarian setting, would be called ordinary civic engagement, and in the 41st millennium can be categorized as a security risk requiring resolution. What the Lexicanum also notes that human slaves are also purchased en masse for the express purpose of conversion into servitors. The Imperium officially does not practice chattel slavery. The theological position is that all humans are servants of the Emperor, but not property of each other. In practice, the line between bonded labor and slavery is sufficiently blurred that Forge World operators can purchase humans for conversion without this being classified as something the law needs to address. The moral vocabulary that would describe this as a problem is not readily available within the conceptual framework of the 41st millennium's institutions. Then there are the failed initiates. We have already discussed the Black Templars' Cenobite servitors, made from neophytes who failed in their duty. But the Black Templars are not the only chapter with this tradition. The Lexicanum notes more broadly that the servitors of some Space Marine chapters are created from failed Marine initiates. This is not universal. Many chapters don't do this, but it is common enough to be mentioned as a general category. The aspirants who survive the initial trials, but are found lacking in some subsequent phase of their development. The ones who almost became something transhuman and extraordinary, and instead became the things that support those who did succeed. The proximity of what they almost had to what they became is, in every case, specific and complete and irreversible. And then there are the people who simply ended up in the wrong place. Or the Rogue Trader game's side quests include multiple instances of servitors made from people who are fairly clearly victims of nothing except the bad luck of encountering someone with the authority to have them converted, and an insufficient reason not to. The choirmaster who servitorized the woman who tried to save him from a mistake, punishing her for the inconvenience of her correctness. The individuals encountered in various quests on Footfall, servitorized in ways the game frames as clearly unjust, their histories enough intact to be recovered by careful investigation, but their persons irrecoverable. These are not outliers presented as shocking exceptions. Yes, they are presented as normal, the kind of thing that happens in this civilization with sufficient regularity that a rogue trader encountering multiple such cases in a single voyage is not particularly surprising. The pipeline, in other words, is wide, and its width is not incidental. It is structural. The Servitor program needs subjects, and the Imperium has arranged itself such that there is never a shortage of candidates. Whether those candidates arrived through a genuine justice system, through casual institutional violence, through economic displacement, or through the misfortune of proximity to someone with too much authority and too little reason to care, they all arrive at the same conversion table, and they all leave through the same process. And the behavioral parameters that govern them afterward do not record how they got there. Part 4. The Hierarchy of the Hollow. Cataloguing the types. Before we go deeper into the horror of consciousness surviving the conversion process, let us spend some time understanding the breadth of what the Imperium has built. Because the variety of servitor types and the extraordinary range of applications they serve is itself a form of argument. It demonstrates how thoroughly normalized this practice is, how many different ways the Imperium has found to use it, how far the concept has been developed across 10,000 years of refinement. The most common variety you will encounter across the 40K literature is the Technomat. This is the baseline utility servitor, the workhorse of Mechanicus operations. These are the thing you see standing next to tech priests and tech marines on battlefields and forge floors throughout the setting. Technomats maintain and operate complex machinery. Their conversion has typically preserved, deliberately and carefully, the neural pathways associated with mechanical understanding, procedural memory, and sensory motor integration, while ablating the higher cognitive functions that the mechanicus regards as superfluous to the role. The result is a being that can intuitively diagnose a machine fault in seconds, that can perform maintenance procedures with a dexterity and precision that would take a human technician years to develop, that never tires and never forgets a procedure and never develops the wrong kind of opinion about how things should be done. The technomat walks through the forge hall among humans who regard it as furniture. The humans eat and sleep and worry about things. The technomat works, and in the spaces between the procedures, the neural pathways that weren't removed process input that doesn't go anywhere. Signals that don't have a destination because the systems that used to interpret them are gone. The forge is loud, the light is orange and constant. These sensory inputs arrive and are processed and disappear into nothing because there is nothing to care about them, unless there is. Then there are lexomats. These are, in a certain terrible way, the most interesting and the most poignant variant when you think about them carefully. Lexomats are servitors with exceptional data processing and calculating capacity, which they are used as living computers, working out mathematical problems and cross-referencing information sets with a speed and contextual sensitivity that conventional cogitators cannot match for certain kinds of complex, judgment-laden calculation. They appear in administratum offices, on starship bridges, in the intelligence sections of military command structures. They are valuable because the human brain, even in its diminished servitor state, retains extraordinary processing capacity for the kind of calculation that requires both pattern recognition and contextual awareness simultaneously. Here is the thing about lexomats that stays with you once you notice it. The reason they are so good at their calculations is specifically because of what was kept during their conversion. And as the mathematical and analytical reasoning that makes a lexomat valuable was not installed by the mechanicus, it grew in a human skull over the course of a human life. It was developed through years of education and practice and engagement with the world. The person who became the lexomat was, at some point, someone who was very good at thinking, someone who understood numbers or data or patterns in a way that most people don't. And the mechanicus, recognizing this capability, preserved the specific neural architecture that produced it, while ablating everything else that the person also was. What was the lexomat before? What did their mathematical mind think about when it wasn't being pointed at calculations? What did they love? What did they find funny? What did they talk about when they weren't working? As these questions have no answers in any mechanicus record, the lexomat in the corner of the administrative office, processing tithe calculations with inhuman speed, is the remains of a person who thought extraordinarily well. The thinking is still happening. What it is thinking about, now that the original thinker is gone, is unclear. Combat servitors represent a category that has its own sub-varieties of horror. At the basic end, you have gun servitors and close combat servitors, beings with weapons built directly into their bodies, where arms and sometimes other limbs used to be. These are relatively standard conversions, the behavioral architecture replaced with targeting subroutines and threat assessment protocols, and the neural pathways preserved, being largely those associated with sensory processing and basic motor function. What they are deployed as bodyguards and fire support and general-purpose violence delivery mechanisms. They are encountered throughout the setting without much comment, because combat servitors are simply what some servitors are. At the heavy end of the combat servitor spectrum sit the cataphron battle servitors, and we have already discussed how they are made. What I want to add here is a dimension that doesn't always get sufficient attention in discussions of the cataphron, the question of what it is like to exist as one over time. The cataphron has been halved. There is no lower body. There is a tracked drive system instead. The creature, the construct, that moves across the battlefield is physically approximately half of what entered the conversion room. The torso, the arms replaced by weapons, the head modified for targeting, and the brain, with its theoretical blank slate that in numerous cases proved not to be entirely blank, If something remains conscious in a cataphron, it exists in a state of physical incompleteness that has no parallel in normal human experience, half a body, permanently. There is no possibility of restoration, even theoretically, because the lower half was not stored somewhere. It was discarded. The conversion is irreversible at the most fundamental physical level. Whatever watches from inside that chassis watches from inside something that was once whole and is now, permanently and without appeal, not. The archoflagellants deserve particular attention because they represent a specific variant on the servitor concept that is, in some ways, more philosophically honest than the standard model. Essentially, an archoflagellant is a convicted heretic sentenced to archoflagellation, a form of capital punishment administered by the Adeptus Mechanicus at the direction of the ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition, reserved for those whose crimes are severe enough to warrant dramatic punishment, but not quite severe enough, or whose specific profile makes them too useful to simply execute. The archoflagellant is subjected to extensive surgical modification. Their arms are replaced with weapons, electroflails, industrial shears, power blades. Chemical injectors are grafted directly onto their spinal column, and they are fitted with a device called a pacifier helm, which connects directly into the cerebrum and the spinal cord. But here is where the archoflagellant diverges from the standard servitor in a way that reveals something about the Imperium's full range of approaches to this concept. The archoflagellant is not extensively lobotomized. Their mind is not wiped. Their higher cognitive functions, in the conventional sense, are still largely present. What the pacifier helm does is occupy those functions, fill them with a constant loop of imperial imagery, sacred hymns, devotional prayers. The visual language of the Emperor's faith humped directly into consciousness at a volume that drowns out everything else. The archoflagellant, while docile, is in a state something like immersed religious experience, but one they did not choose and cannot exit, running on repeat in the prison of their skull. When the pacifier helm is deactivated by a trigger word, when the combat stimulants flood in, the religious experience cuts off, and what replaces it is something that the archoflagellant's person, the person still in there, mind largely intact, then experiences from inside, helplessly, as the combat drugs override every impulse towards self-determination and drive the body into violence. The archoflagellant charges the nearest non-designated target and kills until it can no longer kill or until the helm is reactivated. And somewhere in the mind, that isn't gone. The person who was sentenced to this watches. Then the helm goes back on. The prayers resume. The person is pushed back down under the devotional imagery, waiting in a space between the sacred and the violent until the trigger word comes again. An archoflagellant that survives multiple battles is called an endurant, and is considered to have begun earning their redemption through service. The Imperium finds this concept, that a person reduced to a living weapon, experiencing every battle from the inside, is being redeemed by the experience. To be entirely consistent with its theology, the flesh is purified through sacrifice and service. The heretic is remade into something worthy. This is not cynicism, this is sincere belief. And the person inside the archoflagellant, listening to the prayers loop, waiting for the next trigger word, might have a different perspective on the concept of redemption. And then there are the Cenobite servitors of the Black Templars, and we will give them their own section because they deserve it. Part 5. The philosophy behind the machine. Flesh is weak to fully understand why the Imperium built this system, and why it continues to run it without serious institutional challenge across 10,000 years of documented history. You need to spend genuine time inside the theological framework that makes it possible. Not the framework of the Imperium generally, though that is relevant, but specifically the theology of the cult Mechanicus, whose fingerprints are on every servitor in existence. The cult Mechanicus worships the machine god, who they understand as the source of all knowledge and technology in the universe. In their theological model, the emperor of mankind is the physical embodiment of this entity. The the Omnissiah, of the machine, God made flesh, though this creates the ongoing political tension with the ecclesiarchy.
You know, I have to be honest with you for a second. I've been sitting with this topic for a while now, and there's something about the Servitor Lord specifically that genuinely unsettles me in a way a lot of 40K doesn't. Like the big stuff, the Chaos Gods, the Tyrants eating worlds. That stuff is horrifying, but it's distant. The Servitor is just in the corridor. It's the thing in the background of every piece of art, every scene, every story. And the more I read about it, the harder it became to just treat it as a set dressing. I kept thinking about those Medicaid Servitor lines in Darktide and asking myself, why does that hit different than literally anything else in this universe? And I think the answer is because it's small, it's personal. It's one voice, in the dark, asking for something it's never going to get. And I find that way more affecting than any galaxy-ending threat the setting has ever produced. I don't know what that says about me. Maybe it says I've been spending too much time thinking about this. But honestly, that's kind of what this channel is for. So let's keep going.
That the Imperium manages primarily by both sides, agreeing not to press the question too hard in public. The machine god, in this theology, is the supreme reality. Knowledge is the manifestation of divinity. Things that embody knowledge, machines, ancient technologies, standardized template constructs, the carefully preserved information of ages past, are sacred because of that embodiment. The cult Mechanicus's theology of the body is built on a foundation stated plainly in their most fundamental creed, the Credo Omnissiah. There is no truth in flesh, only betrayal. There is no strength in flesh, only weakness. There is no constancy in flesh, only decay. What there is no certainty in flesh but death. These are not qualifications or nuanced philosophical positions. These are absolutes. Flesh is not merely inferior to metal and circuit. It is morally unreliable. The body is the source of error and failure and mortality. Every augmentation that replaces biological tissue with machine components is not merely a practical upgrade. It is a step towards spiritual purity. The more mechanical you become, the closer you approach the divine. The most advanced tech priests have replaced so much of their biology that they are more architecture than organism, walking cathedrals of chrome and blessed cable, their humanity reduced to a few essential grams of neural tissue that the Omnissiah requires them to maintain. This is genuine faith, sincerely held, was built on thousands of years of institutional experience. And within that faith, the servitor conversion is not a crime. It is not even a compromise. It is, in the Mechanicus's own terms, an act of grace. The criminal or the offender is brought before the conversion process in a state of moral and spiritual corruption. They have offended the sacred order, damaged the holy machinery, disrupted the work of the Omnissiah. By removing the parts of them that committed those crimes, the will, the self-determination, the irrational desires that led them to make bad decisions, the Mechanicus is, in their framing, purifying them. What remains after conversion is not lesser. It is closer to what the Omnissiah wants from all flesh, reliable function in service of a greater purpose. Which the doctrine even has a comforting story about what servitors experience, or rather, what they don't experience. Followers of the cult Mechanicus typically believe that servitors are in a state of communion with the machine god, that those who have sinned against the Omnissiah find, in the conversion, a path to redemption, that through the sacrifice of their will, the thing that made them capable of sin in the first place, they achieve a kind of mechanical grace. Devotional Mechanicus texts describe the servitor's existence as peaceful, purposeful, untroubled by the doubts and fears and desires that make flesh so unreliable. The servitor is beyond suffering. The servitor has been freed from the prison of selfhood. This is the doctrine, and the doctrine has a specific problem, which is that it makes certain predictions about how servitors should behave, and the behavior of servitors does not always match the predictions. There is, within the broader Mechanicus structure, a branch called the Magi Psychana, the biological researchers with expertise in psychic phenomena and the interface between the material and the warp. Most of these magi adhere to the standard positions, but those described by the Lexicanum as having more heretical leanings have arrived, through observation and study, at a conclusion that the mainstream cannot absorb without enormous institutional discomfort. They believe that servitors and servo-skulls, although mindless, still retain their souls. And those souls, the heretical scholars say, suffer greatly. In the 40,000 universe, this is not a metaphorical or poetic statement, but the soul is a physical reality, a presence in the warp, the psychic signature of a living consciousness. What the soul is and what happens to it is a subject of ongoing dispute throughout the setting, but its existence as something real, something that chaos gods can feed on, that the emperor needs for sustenance, that the Eldar built an entire civilization around protecting, is not in question. And the heretical magi are pointing out something specific. The conversion process removes a great deal from the biological substrate, but it cannot remove the soul. The soul is not in the neural tissue. It exists in the warp, attached to the living body through mechanisms that are poorly mapped and incompletely understood. And when you surgically hollow out the bridge between the soul and the mind, when you ablate the systems that allowed the person to be themselves, you do not sever the soul, you strand it. The resulting state, in the heretical scholar's analysis, is one of profound ongoing suffering. The soul continues to exist. It continues to be attached to the biological body. It cannot communicate through the broken bridge, cannot assert itself through the damaged neural substrate, cannot do anything except experience whatever the warp equivalent of watching is, feeling the presence of the body going through its functions, connected to it, unable to direct it, unable to be free of it, and it experiences this indefinitely. Servitors, maintained by the Mechanicus's ritual care, can function for a very long time, decades, centuries in some cases. The organic components decay slowly when properly maintained, and the Mechanicus is scrupulous about maintenance where useful servitors are concerned. The soul, in the heretical scholar's framing, is there for all of it. The mainstream Mechanicus finds this conclusion deeply unacceptable for obvious reasons. The theological superstructure of the servitor program depends on the person being genuinely gone after conversion. If the soul persists, if there is ongoing suffering attached to every servitor, in every forge hall on every world, then what the Mechanicus has been doing for 10,000 years is not redemption. It is something that requires a different word entirely. A word the Mechanicus cannot use about itself. A word the Imperium cannot afford to let circulate in connection with a practice so fundamental to its function. Due to the theory is labelled heretical, and the scholars who advance it are discouraged with various degrees of firmness from advancing it further, and the servitors continue to be built and deployed and used across 1 million worlds. And the question is answered, by default, in the only way the institution finds acceptable. Part 6. Mindlock and the Ghost. Consciousness surfacing. The official doctrine says the person is gone. The operational reality says, sometimes something surfaces. Not reliably, not predictably, not in ways that produce functioning personhood or the ability to resist or refuse, but something. The law has a specific term for what happens when a servitor's modified brain begins trying to reassert something like self-direction. Mindlock. Mindlock, in the operational definition used by the Adeptus Mechanicus, is when a servitor's brain locks up in combat or high-stress conditions, failing to execute its programmed functions because some process in its remaining neural architecture is attempting to assert itself. Without active direction from a tech priest or tech marine, servitors in Mindlock become essentially non-functional, standing there, performing none of their assigned tasks, their behavioral systems unable to override whatever is happening in the deeper portions of the biological substrate. For the Mechanicus, Mindlock is a technical failure, a malfunction, something to be corrected by maintenance, by behavioral cache clearing, by whatever intervention restores the servitor to proper operation. What Mindlock actually looks like when you encounter it in the lore is a servitor babbling. What the official description is that the servitor in Mindlock produces incoherent nonsense as it tries to assert some form of awareness. This phrase, from the Warhammer 40,000 5th edition Space Marines Codex, was written as a technical description of a hardware problem, but read it slowly. Tries to assert some form of awareness. Something is trying. Something is making an attempt. The attempt produces incoherent output because the systems required to produce coherent output have been removed. But the attempt is happening. Something inside the machine is pushing against the interface and getting mostly noise out, but pushing. What might coherent Mindlock output sound like if the noise were removed? What would the babbling become if the behavioral filters were less intact? If more of the original neural architecture remained? If the right conditions aligned to let a cleaner signal through? Please take me with you. I'm so lonely. Why does it hurt? These are not incoherent. These are specific, purposeful, emotionally precise, in fact, far more emotionally precise than you would expect from an entity whose emotional processing architecture is supposed to have been ablated. They are the output of something that has found a way, a narrow, possibly temporary way, to make itself understood, not to assert control, not to resist the behavioral parameters, not to refuse, just to signal, to say, there is something here, there is something still in here, and it has been in here for a very long time, and it is asking you, without any hope of rescue, without any expectation that you will do anything at all, to know that. But the lore also documents cases more significant than individual behavioral blips. The most striking of these, recorded in the Lexicanum, involves an entire vessel, the flagship of the von Valancius Air, one of the game's rogue trader vessels, sailing the outer reaches of Imperial space, where unusual things are more common and more quietly tolerated than in the core worlds. Experience something that cannot be adequately explained by the conventional model of servitor behavior. All of the servitors aboard the ship spontaneously regained full consciousness. Not a partial glitch, not isolated behavioral anomalies. Full consciousness, as evidenced by what observers could see. The desperate, non-functional, non-programmed movement of their eyes, tracking things that had no tactical relevance, with the trembling of bodies that had no behavioral subroutine, requiring them to tremble. The terror, unmistakable, recognizable, absolutely not an optimized output, that the servitors displayed when one of their number was disassembled in front of them. Terror, not a combat readiness response, not a threat assessment calculation output. Terror, the visceral, immediate response of a conscious being watching another conscious being taken apart. Whatever had been locked behind the walls of behavioral programming and chemical ablation was, in this moment, entirely present and entirely aware of what was happening to it and to others like it. And the detail the Lexicanum adds is, if anything, more unsettling than the terror itself. Despite this, they did not speak freely, and were capable of continuing their duties with no loss of function, in essence conscious, yet trapped within their servitorized bodies. Conscious, yet trapped, still working, still performing every function in their behavioral suite. Whatever came back to consciousness did not give the servitors the ability to refuse, to resist, to stop doing their jobs. The programming still ran. The directives were still followed. The bodies still moved through their tasks with mechanical fidelity. The only thing that changed was that something in those bodies was now fully aware of doing so, fully aware of being unable to stop, fully aware that they were conscious, finally and completely, and that consciousness made no practical difference at all to their situation, except to let them feel what their situation was. Ye conscious yet trapped within their servitorized bodies. It is possible to stare at those 5 words for a very long time. What happened to them after this event depended on the rogue trader in command. A more dogmatic commander would have ordered the behavioral caches cleared, a secondary intervention, another erasure, back to nothing. Because the servitors' crimes remained unpaid, in the Imperium's ledger, and the re-emergence of consciousness was a technical malfunction, rather than a morally significant event. A more iconoclastic commander might have made different choices. The law, with characteristic patience, leaves the outcome open. It presents the choice and steps back. What the rogue trader decided is between them and the reader. Chance, this is not the only documented instance of consciousness surviving or re-emerging in servitor bodies. The character Ismail de Rovin, who appears in the Adeptus Mechanicus novel series, is a servitor who achieved something close to full recovery. Through circumstances that are described in the novels as potentially miraculous, potentially a blessing of the Omnissiah, certainly highly unusual. He retains capabilities that standard servitors do not possess. The ability to interface with archaeotech in ways that suggest more than programmed response. The ability to influence an archoflagellant in ways that imply genuine psychic or cognitive engagement with another mind. His recovery, in the novels, becomes theologically significant to some of the characters around him, evidence of something extraordinary at work. But what makes Ismail most interesting for our purposes is the implication of his existence. If he was in there the whole time, aware, experiencing, trapped in what the novel suggests was genuine consciousness throughout his servitorhood, then the question his recovery raises is not just about him. It is about everyone, about every servitor in every corridor of every installation Ismail has ever been near, about the ones he passed in the forge halls, about the ones maintaining the ships, about the ones processing the calculations, about the one in the corner of the room you're picturing right now. Were they in there too? In the short story, Memories of Flesh by Matthew Farrer, the conversion process is approached from a perspective disturbingly close to the subject's. Whilst the language Farrer employs does not give us a clear window into a surviving consciousness, it is more suggestive than that, more elusive, more honest, about the uncertainty of what the experience actually is. But it gives us this. Blessing iron. Why? Why iron alive? Blessing. Override code. Kill me. Override code. Your eye. Your eye. Your eye. Your cutting. Ripping. Unutterable, obliterating pain. The stink of blood and hot machine oil. The towering figure in power armor watching impassively as a voice shrieked for mercy. A voice that the servitor did not remember as the one it used to own. No ability to understand the images, dragged out of its lacerated mind. No consciousness to understand what had happened to it. That last line is doing something precise. No consciousness to understand what had happened to it. The understanding is gone, but the material is still there. Still accessible, still dragged out, still present as a kind of echo that doesn't know it is an echo. The conversion didn't produce nothing. It produced something that cannot understand itself, something that reaches for context it cannot find, something that carries the screaming in it without knowing what the screaming was. And sometimes it pushes that screaming through the behavioral filters as 5 words. Please take me with you. Part 7. The Black Templars and their prayer machines. The Black Templars are worth their own extended section in any serious discussion of servitors because their relationship with the practice illuminates dimensions of the thing that the Adeptus Mechanicus's clinical framework tends to obscure. But the Black Templars are a Space Marine chapter founded from the Imperial Fist's genetic legacy, inheritors of Rogel Dawn's stubborn architectural virtue. They are the crusading chapter, the ones who never stop moving, never settle into a fortress monastery on a single world and wait for war to come to them, but instead keep an eternal crusade fleet moving through the galaxy, from one war to the next, an endless pilgrimage of righteous violence. They are, even by Space Marine standards, extraordinarily devout. Faith is not one element of their culture, it is the foundation. The Black Templars crusade because they believe, with complete and unironic conviction, that the God Emperor wills it, and that the greatest expression of devotion is the willingness to fight and die in his name without hesitation. What the chapter's chaplains are consequently among the most important figures in the Black Templars organization. These are the warrior priests who maintain spiritual discipline, who lead the chapter in its devotions, who deliver the oaths and the prayers that give meaning to the violence. The chaplains are revered not just as spiritual leaders, but as the living embodiment of the chapter's faith, figures who represent the connection between the fight and the meaning of the fight. And following the chaplains, always, are the Cenobite servitors. These small, modified figures walk in the shadow of the chaplains wherever they go. They carry the chapter's sacred relics into battle, handling the physical weight of holy objects that the chaplain's attention must be elsewhere to carry. They intone prayers and hymns in their modified vocal systems, words of devotion produced by machines that were built for vocal output, theological texts downloaded into behavioral parameters, playing on a loop that fills the battlefield with the chapter's spiritual intention. They chant the sermons the chaplains deliver, their voices a kind of echo or amplification of the spoken faith. A battle brother who has distinguished himself can earn the service of a Cenobite servitor as a mark of honor, a visible sign of trust and status within the chapter. The Cenobite servitors are, in the Black Templar's aesthetic and spiritual framework, instruments of faith, walking embodiments of the chapter's devotion, sacred objects in their own right, and they are made from the chapter's failures. Through the Warhammer 40,000 lore, the archived page and multiple secondary sources, including Bell of Lost Souls, is consistent on this point. The neophytes of the Black Templars who fail in their duty are frequently converted into Cenobite servitors. The neophyte who fell short, the aspirant who survived the physical transformation but was found, at some stage of training or judgment, to have failed in some dimension of the chapter's moral or spiritual expectations. Not the ones who simply died, which is accepted as the most common outcome for those who aren't strong enough. The ones who failed in a way that marked them as unworthy of the full transformation, but potentially still useful in service. They become the things that carry the relics. Take a moment to hold the full weight of that. The Cenobite servitors walking behind the chaplain were, not very long ago in many cases, people who wanted to be space marines, who went through the terrifying ordeal of Black Templars recruitment, who survived the initial selection process that the vast majority of aspirants don't survive, who received some portion of the genetic and surgical modifications that begin the process of creating a transhuman warrior, who learned the chapter's theology, absorbed its prayers and oaths and specific devotional tradition, perhaps began to feel genuine connection to those prayers and oaths, who wanted nothing more than to be worthy of the armor they hadn't yet earned. And then something went wrong. Some failure of nerve at a critical moment, perhaps. Some moral lapse, or an error of judgment. Or a spiritual failure that the chapter's chaplains assessed and found too significant to overlook. The chapter doesn't detail its internal processes in the lore, so we don't know what level of failure produces a Cenobite rather than a simple termination. But we know that the result is conversion. The person who wanted to be a Black Templar becomes the thing that walks behind the Black Templars. If the heretical Magi Psychana are right, if something persists after conversion, watching from inside the machine, then the Cenobite servitors carry a particular quality of experience that makes their situation genuinely different from most servitors. They know what they lost, not as an abstract fact, but as a deeply specific one. They were close enough to touch it. They knew the theology they are now forced to recite, which before the conversion removed the capacity to choose to recite it. They heard the prayers with the understanding of someone who wanted to mean them, before the conversion replaced that understanding with mechanical production of sound. They marched with the chapter as aspirants, before the conversion made them march with it as furniture. The prayers playing through the Cenobite's vocal systems were the same prayers the aspirant tried to memorize, tried to understand, tried to make their own. Now they play without understanding, without feeling, produced by a behavioral parameter rather than a heart. And somewhere below the behavioral parameter, if anything remains, that might be the most specific kind of loss that exists in the 40,000 universe, knowing precisely what you had and what you became instead. It is worth noting something about how the Black Templars themselves relate to their Cenobite servitors. They do not appear, in the lore, to regard this as a practice that requires apology or careful framing. A battle brother who earns a Cenobite as a mark of honor is not troubled, in any documented account, by the knowledge of what the Cenobite used to be. The chapter also has the tradition, noted in the Ajaxian Crusade records, of converting chapter serfs who die in battle into servitors to continue serving. The crew of a stalker tank called Xenosbane being crewed by the fallen serfs of that campaign. The chapter's own historical documentation presents this as a great honor, an expression of respect. The dead continued to fight. The fallen were not wasted, service beyond death. And this is the cultural context that makes Cenobite creation possible without cognitive dissonance. Within the Black Templar's worldview, continued service after death or failure is not a punishment. It is an elevation. It is the chapter's dead and failed, still present, still contributing, still connected to the fight. The fact that the contribution is mechanical, the connection is involuntary, and the presence may involve ongoing suffering in the warp soul attached to the converted body. These are not questions the chapter's theology has made space to ask. There is something in this specific case that cuts deeper than the usual 40K grimdark. It is the proximity. The fact that the Cenobite servitor, walking behind the chaplain chanting prayers, was so close to the thing it lost that it almost made it. As that the failure was not so catastrophic as to produce simple death, but specific enough to produce something that might be worse than death. Something that carries on exactly where it failed. And the prayers continue, in the middle of battle, in the quiet of the ship between crusades, in whatever peace the chapter manages between wars. The Cenobite recites them, the chaplain delivers them, the chapter fights, and if anything watches from inside the Cenobite, it watches the thing it wanted to be, walks in its shadow, speaks its words. Part 8. The terrible scale, the world, the servitor makes. We need to spend some time on scale, because one of the things that makes the servitor lore quietly devastating rather than dramatically awful is the sheer extent of what has been built using this practice. It is not unusual, or it is not exceptional. It is not even particularly remarkable within the 41st millennium to encounter servitors anywhere at any time. They are the wallpaper of the setting. Consider Mars alone, the original Forge world, the cradle of the Adeptus Mechanicus, hosts a servitor population in the tens of millions. Mars is one world. The Imperium has approximately 1 million. Not all of them have servitor populations of Martian scale, but the principle applies at every level. Every administratum building of any size uses servitors for data processing and maintenance. Every Space Marine chapter has servitor complement attached to its tech marines and handling the less specialized maintenance and labor work. Every major warship carries servitors. Every significant installation uses them. Every Forge world's industrial output depends on them. Every Inquisitor's retinue typically includes at least a few for specialized purposes. The Lexicanum notes a detail that deserves its own moment of attention. A single servitor can perform the labor of approximately 20 humans. This makes them the most economically efficient labor force conceivable. Once the initial conversion cost is paid, in material, in tech priest time, in the raw resource of a human body, and the biomechanical components required to rebuild it, a servitor's operational costs are minimal. Maintenance is cheaper than wages. Mechanical components are cheaper than healthcare. A servitor does not need to eat in any quantity that registers on a Forge world's logistical spreadsheets. It does not sleep, does not grieve, does not slow down in the middle of a shift because something difficult happened outside of work. Yet it does not organize. It does not ask for things. The replacement of human labor forces with servitor labor is documented across multiple lore sources. Worlds that adopt the program at scale find that their previous human workforce is no longer economically necessary. This is handled differently on different worlds. Some worlds maintain the displaced humans in some other function. Some worlds simply have fewer humans than they used to, and the Administratum's records reflect this without comment. The econometric logic of the Servitor program, taken to its conclusion, suggests a future in which human labor, the ordinary, biological, conscious labor of the Imperium's trillion-plus citizens, is progressively replaced by converted or vat-grown machines that are better at the work. This is not a future the lore typically dwells on directly, but the trend is present in the background of the setting with the patience that characterizes the best 40,000 world-building. The Mechanicus is not plotting to replace humanity. They are simply applying their theology consistently, and their theology says that the machine is better, and in the specific economic context of maintaining a galactic civilization, the math supports this consistently enough that institutions don't need to be malicious to arrive at results that are. The other dimension of scale that matters is time, 10,000 years, the Horus Heresy, which marks the beginning of the current age, and the calcification of many of the Imperium's worst institutional habits was 10,000 years ago. The Servitor program existed before the Horus Heresy, and it has been running in one form or another for at least that long, likely longer. The practice has had 10,000 years to become normalized, to accumulate the doctrinal weight that makes it unquestionable, to become so woven into the fabric of daily life across the Imperium that challenging it feels like challenging the existence of roads or weather. In 10,000 years, how many people have become servitors? The lore does not attempt to calculate this. It is probably incalculable. The number would be large enough that the human mind's capacity for emotional arithmetic, the faculty by which we feel the weight of numbers as something more than abstraction, would simply break down. Past a certain point, scale becomes a kind of insulation. 1,000 deaths is a tragedy. 1 billion deaths is a statistic. Or 1 trillion conversions over 10 millennia is just the way things work. This is how the Imperium metabolizes the Servitor, not through active cruelty, not through conscious decision to cause suffering, but through a process of normalization so thorough and so extended in time that the question of whether there is suffering to cause has become not just unanswerable, but essentially unaskable. The question cannot even be clearly formulated within the conceptual vocabulary that most citizens of the Imperium have available to them, because that vocabulary was built within a civilization that built the Servitor program before living memory and has treated it as natural law ever since. Part 9. Why does it matter? The philosophical horror. The Servitor is not just a horror story. It is a particular kind of statement about how civilizations can make themselves incapable of asking their own most important questions. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is full of horrors. Most of them announce themselves. Chaos is spectacular and terrible. The Tyrannid swarm is overwhelming in scale. The Necrons are ancient and cold, and their indifference is the indifference of geological processes. These are the horrors that define the setting's aesthetic. Vast, dramatic, impossible to ignore. And they are real horrors, compelling and well-constructed and genuinely unsettling in their specific ways. The Servitor horror is different. The Servitor horror is the horror of the ordinary. It does not announce itself. It stands in corridors you already walk through. It sits behind healing stations you use without thinking, and it processes data in offices you pass without looking into. It has been in those corridors and offices since before you were born, and it will be there after you are gone. And at some point someone will need to clear its cache and replace some worn mechanical components, and it will continue. And nothing about this will register as remarkable. The specific philosophical question the Servitor poses is one of recognition. The question of whether we are willing to see a thing for what it is, given sufficient institutional pressure to see it for something else, given sufficient theological scaffolding built over sufficient time to make the alternative interpretation feel not just difficult, but transgressive, a heresy in fact, punishable by the very process whose nature you are questioning. And in the story of the von Valancius servitors gaining full consciousness and the rogue trader having to decide what to do about it, the lore is essentially asking, what do you do when you can no longer deny that the thing is looking back? When the movement of the eyes is unmistakably the movement of a person, not a machine. When the terror at watching another be disassembled is too specific, too human, too precisely what terror looks like to be written off as behavioral output. You have, at that moment, a choice. You can clear the cache and restore the machine to proper operation and never speak of it again, or you can do something else entirely. The law leaves this open because the answer depends on who you are. It is, in this way, was doing what the best speculative fiction always does, presenting a situation that is impossible in our world but structurally identical to situations that are entirely possible in ours, and asking what you would do. The servitor that regained consciousness is a thought experiment wearing a power cell and a servo arm. What do you owe the thing in the corner when the thing in the corner turns out to be watching you? The Imperium has a very clear institutional answer to this question, which is, you owe it nothing that you owed the servitor before you knew it was watching. Its function has not changed. Its status has not changed. Its crimes, if it was converted for crimes, have not been paid. If anything, the re-emergence of consciousness is a malfunction, something to be corrected rather than a fact to be reckoned with. The Imperium's answer is built from 10,000 years of precedent, and it is internally consistent, and it is wrong in a way that the setting holds up for examination without telling you it is wrong, because it never tells you anything directly. The 40,000 universe, at its best, presents these moral situations with perfect deadpan. It does not condemn the Imperium. It does not celebrate it either. It builds the world in full, shows you how the logic connects, lets you watch the consequences play out, and then leaves you alone with what you've seen. The horror is not editorial, it is architectural. The horror is in the structure of the thing, visible once you see the structure, impossible to unsee after. Back to part 10, the weight of the ordinary. What the setting is doing, one of the things that separates the servitor from almost every other horror in 40K is precisely its normalcy. The Chaos Gods are terrifying, but they are also dramatic. Their presence is announced, their influence creates spectacles, their servants look the part. A demon prince or a Chaos Space Marine is unmistakably a horror. You cannot mistake it for furniture. The servitor is furniture. That is the point. The servitor is in the corridor you are already walking through, and you have already walked past it without looking at it this week and last week and every week since you were old enough to know what the word servitor meant, and that is normal, and the servitor is normal, and there is nothing to see here because there never is. This is how things work. And this is how things have always worked. There is a concept in moral philosophy sometimes called the banality of evil. The observation that extraordinary harm can be perpetrated not through exceptional malice, but through the ordinary application of routine processes, the following of procedures, the doing of jobs, the execution of functions within a system that no individual within the system designed, and for which no individual within the system bears what feels like personal responsibility. The Servitor program, in this light, is not maintained by villains. It is maintained by people doing their jobs. Magi biologists performing their conversions. Arbitrators handing over sentenced individuals. Tech priests maintaining their servitor complements. Chapter masters approving the use of failed initiates. Nobody should, in the chain of decisions that produces any individual servitor, experiences themselves as doing anything fundamentally wrong. They are following doctrine. They are applying law. They are maintaining civilization. The 40,000 setting models this with extraordinary precision. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in its approach to servitor creation, is not a caricature of evil. The individual tech priests who perform conversions are not sadists, or most of them aren't anyway. They are people who genuinely believe that what they are doing is appropriate, justified, even beneficial. Their theology tells them so. Their training tells them so. The accumulated weight of 10,000 years of institutional practice tells them so. They perform the conversions with the same professional attention they bring to any technically demanding work. And they move on to the next task, and the servitors go about their assigned functions, and the Imperium continues. The laws, small patient interventions, the quote about the Parieto insular cortex, The system's failure, why does it hurt? The von Valancius incident, the desperately moving eyes, are the setting's way of inviting you to stop walking past. To look at the thing in the corner the way the thing in the corner looks at you, if it can look. To ask the question that the institution has made unaskable, not in order to fix anything. The 40,000 universe does not offer you the ability to fix its problems, and any serious engagement with the setting accepts this. But in order to not be the person who didn't notice, to not be the person who walked past without registering what they walked past, as the Medici servitor in Darktide says, "Please take me with you," and the soldiers walk past. This is not a failure of the soldiers. They have a war to fight and a city to save, and an obligation to the mission that is more urgent than any single uncomfortable moment with a machine that shouldn't have said that. They walk past because that is the rational response to their situation. The horror is not in the walking past. The horror is in the situation that makes walking past the rational response. The horror is in the world that built a situation like that in every corridor of every city, and then built a civilization that can walk through it without stopping, because stopping would be the beginning of asking a question that cannot be safely finished. The 40K universe invites you to stop, just for a moment, and just long enough to hear what the machine said. Part 9b, the servo skull. The dead who keep serving. We have focused primarily on servitors, but the lore extends this same set of questions to a closely related category of construct that deserves its own moment, the servo skull. Because the servo skull applies the same basic logic, take the remains of a person, add machinery, create a functional tool, at a different scale, and with a different kind of intimacy that makes it, in some ways, its own specific variety of disturbing. A servo skull is exactly what it sounds like. It is a human skull, recovered from a body, sometimes a notable individual, sometimes an ordinary person, sometimes a combat casualty, sometimes a specifically prepared donor, fitted with anti-gravity suspensors, a compact power source, and whatever sensory or functional hardware is required for its intended role. A servo skull might carry messages, operate as a mobile holographic projector, perform continuous auspex scanning, provide illumination, or undertake any of a dozen other small utility functions. They float at shoulder height or lower, bobbing slightly with whatever their installed suspensors are calibrated for, and they are encountered throughout the Imperium with the same casual ubiquity as servitors. In the halls of the Inquisition, in the chambers of high-ranking Imperial officials, in the workshops of tech priests, in the corridors of ships. They are made from the skulls of people who have been carefully preserved after death, or sometimes not carefully. The lore acknowledges significant variation in how servo skulls are produced. Yessi from the reverently crafted skull of a devoted servant of the Imperium, honoured in death by being given continuing function, to the industrial batch production of skulls harvested from convenient sources and implanted with standardized hardware on a production line. The honoured dead, continuing to serve in some cases. In others, the discarded dead, repurposed. The heretical Magiwakamishi Saikana's position includes servo skulls alongside servitors when they speak of continued suffering after conversion. The soul, in their framework, does not require a living body to persist. The warped presence of a person can remain attached to physical remains, to bone, for a significant time after death, under the right circumstances. And the right circumstances for maintaining a warp attachment to bone include, apparently, as the implantation of active technology into that bone. The machine spirits that the Mechanicus believes inhabit all technology have something to do with this, perhaps. The specific mechanism is unclear, but the heretical scholar's claim is that the servo skull is not just a machine shaped like a skull. It is a skull that still, in some sense, remembers being attached to a face. This is the claim. Whether it is true, whether the skull of the honoured servant floating at the Inquisitor's shoulder retains something of the servant, experiences something of the experience of floating in corridors rather than resting in a grave, is exactly as verifiable as the equivalent claim about living servitors, which is to say, not very, through conventional means. But the law keeps the question open with the same patient consistency it keeps the servitor question open. What does the servo skull see, if it sees? The corridors it floats through are different from the corridors the person walked through. The rooms it attends are occupied by different people, serving different purposes, in a different time. If something in the bone remembers the person who occupied it, what does it make of what it sees now? What does it make of the hands that hold it? The commands it receives? The darkness it hangs in when its master sleeps? What does it make of being a floating skull in a universe where this is considered normal? The Inquisitor who uses a servo skull made from a trusted agent's remains is, in the Imperium's framing, honoring that agent, giving them continuing purpose, keeping them close, but in some sense, even past death. This framing is sincere and is embedded in a cultural tradition that values loyalty and service above almost everything. The Inquisitor does not think of the servo skull as a horror. They may genuinely regard it with affection, this floating reminder of someone they trusted, still useful, still present, still doing the small work it was always suited for. And if the heretical scholars are right, the skull hangs there, and something in the warp attached to its bone watches, and the Inquisitor who holds it with affection cannot hear what the skull might say about this affection, if it had a voice to say anything about anything, which it doesn't. That part didn't survive the skull's separation from its body. The servo skull flies on its suspensors and performs its scans. But the Inquisitor drinks their recaf and reads their reports, and the hovering thing that was someone watches from a place that is neither here nor there, the way all the servitors watch, the way everything in the 41st millennium that used to be, someone watches, from behind the wall that the conversion put up, or the death that came before anyone thought to ask, or the 10,000 years of institutional momentum that decided long ago that the question wasn't necessary. Part 9c, the comparison we cannot avoid, archoflagellants and the spectrum of surviving consciousness. It is worth constructing a clear map of where archoflagellants sit, relative to servitors in the spectrum of surviving consciousness, because the comparison reveals something important about the Imperium's range of choices and what each choice implies. What the standard servitor conversion is designed to produce a blank. Take the person, remove the person, keep the operational substrate. This is the endpoint being aimed at, even if the conversion process frequently fails to fully achieve it. The ethical position of the Imperium regarding this outcome is that there is no ethical issue, because there is no person remaining to have an ethical issue on behalf of. The machine is not a person. It does not have interests. It does not experience. The conversion has been thorough, and what remains is a tool. The archoflagellant conversion is a completely different design philosophy, and the gap between the two reveals a great deal about the range of things the Imperium is willing to do and for what purposes. The archoflagellant's higher cognitive functions are, as noted earlier, so largely preserved. The person is still there. Their mind is still running. What has been done to them is not erasure, but restraint. The pacifier helm, occupying the conscious mind with a continuous loop of devotional content. The combat drugs available for activation at the handler's discretion. The body rebuilt with weapons in place of limbs. The archoflagellant is a person who has been made into a weapon while remaining a person, which is arguably worse than being made into a weapon through the removal of personhood. The official justification for this design is theological. The archoflagellant is a penitent. They committed heresy severe enough to warrant transformation, but not severe enough to warrant execution that precluded the possibility of redemption. The redemption occurs through service, specifically through the service of fighting the enemies of the Emperor, of doing useful violence on behalf of the Imperium while the body still has life in it, of spending that life down in combat until there is nothing left to spend. The ecclesiarchy's position is that this process genuinely does expunge sin, that the suffering and the service together constitute an atonement that allows the person's soul to eventually find peace in the Emperor's light. This is sincerely held. The ecclesiarchy means it. The chaplains who control archoflagellants and pray for them genuinely believe they are doing those people a service by giving them the chance to earn redemption through dramatic suffering rather than simply dying for their crimes. The archoflagellant presumably experiences this differently. Thus, what the archoflagellant experiences from the inside is the pacifier helm's devotional content on a continuous loop. Sacred imagery, hymns, prayer texts, the emotional palette of imperial devotion filtered through a neural interface into something less chosen experience, a more total environment. The person inside is not unconscious. They are present but occupied, immersed in something that moves through their consciousness like water moves through a vessel, leaving no room for anything else. This is sometimes described, in materials that take the theological framing seriously, as a kind of grace, the archoflagellant filled with the presence of the Emperor's love, sustained by devotion during the long waiting periods between battles. And then the trigger word activates. The pacifier helm cuts out. The combat stimulants flood in. And whatever was present in the devotional loop is replaced by the unmediated experience of extreme physiological stimulation and the compulsion toward violence that the combat drugs produce. The body charges. The weapons built into the body's former arms engage. The combat unfolds. The archoflagellant tearing through enemies with the terrifying single-mindedness that the stimulants produce, unable to hold back, unable to distinguish targets with precision, unable to do anything except the violence the conversion was designed to enable. And somewhere behind the stimulants, behind the compulsion, there is still a person, watching, unable to stop any of it, experiencing the full sensory impact of being a living weapon in the middle of a battlefield, unable to do anything except experience it, want the combat and the damage and the killing and the being damaged in return, all of it arriving in full resolution to a mind that is still present enough to process it, but not free enough to refuse it. The pacifier helm comes back on. The battle ends. The devotional loop resumes. The person waits in the grace of the Emperor's presence, or in the immersive occupation of a loop they didn't choose, for the next trigger word. Whether this is better or worse than the standard servitor conversion is, in a sense, the wrong question. Both are terrible, but they are terrible in different ways that reveal different things about the institution that designed them. The servitor conversion attempts to remove the person to avoid the question of what is being done to the person. The archoflagellant conversion keeps the person deliberately shunned because the theological value of the punishment depends on there being someone to experience it. The erasure is not the point for the archoflagellant. The suffering is the point. The service is the point. The presence of the person to experience their own redemption is precisely what is required. In this specific way, the archoflagellant conversion is more honest about what it is doing than the standard servitor conversion. It does not pretend that the person is gone. It depends on the person being present. The cost of this honesty is that the person is unambiguously present for every battle, every killing, every moment of being driven by combat drugs through a charging run at the enemy, every wound sustained and every wound inflicted. The cost of the honesty is the archoflagellant's continuous, documented, as unavoidable experience of the punishment they have been sentenced to. The standard servitor conversion tries to erase the experience. The archoflagellant conversion tries to weaponize it. Both of these things are done in the Emperor's name, by people who believe they are serving something good. This is not presented as a condemnation of those people within the setting's own moral framework. It is simply what the setting is. Before we reach the closing section, there is one more dimension of the servitor law that deserves attention because it opens up a philosophical angle that the other sections don't fully address. The question of what it means that servitors are, according to the law, almost entirely immune to demonic possession. This is a fact stated with matter-of-fact consistency across multiple law sources. Was demons who normally spread their influence through the emotions and desires of living beings, feeding on fear and anger and ambition and despair, entering through the cracks that longing and hatred and hope open in a person's psychic defenses, find servitors essentially useless as hosts. A demon that successfully possesses a servitor finds it provides little in the way of sustenance because the servitor's emotional void leaves nothing for the demon to feed on. The possession can happen, the sources confirm, but the daemon gets nothing from it, and the servitor's lack of emotional complexity provides a uniquely inhospitable environment. The Imperium and the cult. Mechanicus cite this as evidence that the conversion process has produced something that is, in a real sense, beyond the reach of chaos. The servitor's lack of self makes it immune to the corruptions of self. Without desires, it cannot be tempted. Without fear, it cannot be threatened. Without hope, it cannot be seduced. The machines walk through environments saturated with chaos influence that drive trained space marines to madness, and they continue performing their maintenance routines unaffected. From the Mechanicus's perspective, this is perhaps the most powerful argument for the theological validity of the conversion process. The servitor, stripped of selfhood, has been elevated beyond the reach of the galaxy's greatest enemy. Now hold that argument next to the heretical Magi Psychana's position that the souls of servitors persist and suffer in the warp. If the soul is still there, if the warp presence of the converted person continues to exist, she's attached to the body, experiencing whatever the warp equivalent of witnessing is.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.